different from the countryside in more ways than you might imagine. Take the weather, for instance. The city is usually 5 to 10 degrees warmer than the countryside surrounding it. Jeff Morrow has the story.
It's called the urban heat island. Scientists have studied it for more than 100 years. During warm daylight hours in the city, solar energy is absorbed by the asphalt in the streets, the stone and metal of the buildings, and sometimes you can feel the heat radiating from them. But in the country during the day, there are trees and grass and bushes and such that are full of water, and the sun's energy is used to evaporate the water, so that tends to cool the air. Think of it as country perspiration. And the heat island effect continues at night. Since the greenery of the country doesn't absorb as much heat, the air cools off fairly quickly. But in the city, all that stored up solar energy slowly releases into the air to keep the city warmer at night. That's bad news in the summer when there's too much heat. Then city dwellers swelter all day and all night. And in the winter, it may be raining in the city, but snowing in the suburbs. I guess that may be bad news for the city kids, too. However, if your mom's got to drive to work, she'll be real happy. Jeff Morrow, The Weather Channel.
Well, let's talk more about today's focus, city versus countryside weather, and it can be vastly different from many angles. So first of all, let's take a day when we have a fair amount of sunshine. On this particular day that we've illustrated here, not a cloud to be seen. A lot of incoming solar radiation. Now, you may know that as the solar radiation comes down, it initially warms the soil, it warms the ground, and then what happens is the warm ground starts to heat up the air which is sitting just above the ground, and eventually that warming extends a little more and more as you go through the day into the afternoon. So by late afternoon you have a fairly thick layer of warm air. In the countryside, because of the presence of trees, vegetation, grass, bushes, trees, what we find out is that some of the incoming radiation does not go into necessarily heating the soil per se, but it's used in the evaporation process. We do have some moisture out there residing within the blades of the grass, in the trees, and it's that moisture which is evaporating, which uses up some of the sun's energy. Now, it's a little cooler as a result of that. Perhaps only a couple of degrees, but again, some of the energy is used up in the evaporation process. Not the case in the city. You may see a couple of trees here and there, but generally we're talking about a lot of cement, a lot of heat coming into the city. Same sun angle here, the incoming solar radiation heating up the cityscape, and as a result of lack of vegetation, a lot of that incoming energy is used to heat the surrounding part of the city. Now we go on in and take a look at what's happening here. We have mentioned the evaporation process being used, and that takes in some of the incoming solar radiation. But with the concrete and pavement, no moisture being held here, so we don't really have any cooling per se. Certainly nothing of the magnitude that you would find in the countryside. Okay, let's go ahead and give you an example, for instance. If we were to look at the temperatures, country versus city, 3 in the afternoon. 91 out in the country, 94 in the city. 6 o'clock, 86 in the country. It's still warm in the city, above 90 degrees. Look what happens as you head into the nighttime hours. At midnight, it's 71 out in the country. As things have cooled off quite a bit, it's 81 downtown because of all the heat coming out of the buildings. The heat tends to store the building tends to store the heat during the day and then slowly releases it at night. Out in the countryside, we have a process in the atmosphere called strong radiational cooling. On a clear night, a lot of the energy, a lot of the warmth that has been attained by the low levels of the atmosphere is quickly lost out to space, so it'll cool off very quickly, especially after sunset in the countryside. But in the city, a lot of the heat that's been stored in the cement and the buildings starts to just radiate out into the surrounding air, so it is quite a bit warmer. Typical summer evening in Washington, D.C., out at one of the surrounding airports, well west of town, 75 degrees. But as we come on inside the Beltway, it's 85 degrees as you head closer towards the Potomac. So again, there's a look at that comparison, and it is quite dramatic on some nighttime hours as you roll from 9 to midnight, city versus country. And you can have a big difference too with storm tracks. New York City, near the coast, strong warm winds coming in off the ocean. Snow to rain, a lot of folks have seen that in this part of New York City out on the island, but in the interior section, Cold air tends to hold on a lot longer, so we end up with a lot more snow. And it can be a big difference from, let's say, Newark and Northwest to Long Island, where we may have very little snow from a storm, but quite a bit as we head especially into northwestern Jersey. Here's a look at some additional information.
There's another funny thing about the weather in the city, the way the wind behaves. Sometimes when you're walking down a city street, the wind is so strong it's like walking in a wind tunnel. Jeanetta Jones explains why.
Winds down the canyons of a city street, buried deep between tall buildings, are sometimes incredibly strong. We can find the reason for that in something called fluid mechanics. That's the study of how things like water or air flow. It works just like the water in this hose. Water flows at a steady rate through the hose, but cover part of the opening with your thumb to make it smaller and watch what happens. You have not increased the amount of water through the hose, but its pressure and speed are much greater after it passes through the small opening. That's what happens to air when it's forced between two buildings. What starts out as a fairly nice little breeze turns into something closer to a gale when it's squeezed in between the building's walls. Remember that next time when you're blowing down Main Street. Just another funny thing about living in the city. I'm Jeanetta Jones, the Weather Channel.
Some cities have peculiar weather patterns because of their geographic locations. For instance, the Los Angeles area suffers from intense brush fires because of hot, dry winds which feed the fires. The Weather Channel's Alan Jackson explains.
The Santa Ana winds of Southern California have been the scourge of firefighters for many years. These winds do not start brush fires, but they aggravate the conditions that allow fires to develop. And naturally, wind makes fires grow and spread rapidly. This hot, dry wind generally forms when high pressure is situated near the Great Basin. Clockwise airflow around the high brings in air over the mountains and desert. Some of this air picks up speed as it's funneled through the mountain passes and canyons of the San Gabriel and San Bernardino Mountains. Santa Ana's make conditions ripe for wildfires by sucking the moisture out of already dry vegetation. Under these conditions, a tiny spark can quickly turn into a raging wildfire. Alan Jackson, the Weather Channel.
Again, we mentioned this is Severe Weather Awareness Week in parts of the southeast, and it was on this date in 1971 when a deadly tornado did hit the area. Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, very hard hit. 119 people killed, 1,600 injured. Now look at the winds estimated that day between 207 and 260 miles per hour, and the damage estimate about $19 million. Now for the week, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida under severe weather awareness, and it's not surprising. Late winter and early spring, this is our season. Then you get into the latter stages of May and June. That season moves up into the Ohio Valley and the Missouri Valley area. Yearly average for thunderstorms, very high. Folks in Tampa will attest to that. They get better than 100 per year, and tornadoes tend to be concentrated over the southeast early in the year, but you can also see the highest concentration over the course of a given year is in Texas as well as Oklahoma. As many as 139 reported in the state of Texas. Okay, stay with us tomorrow on the Weather Channel. Our topic will deal with the water cycle for the weather.